Tonight, one nanny faces an impossible choice. Stay silent and watch the children she loves wither away, or speak up and lose the only family that has ever truly needed her. What would you do? Breaking tonight. Child psychology experts confirm that 73% of children from high-stress households show dramatic behavioral improvements when paired with the right caregiver. But the story you're about to hear happened just 18 hours ago in Manhattan's Upper East Side, where silence became the most powerful form of communication anyone had ever witnessed. Wait until you see what the security cameras revealed about those quiet moments. What millionaire tech entrepreneur David Blackstone discovered will challenge everything you think you know about childcare, about communication, and about the hidden ways people heal broken hearts. And it all started with a whispered bedtime story that no one was supposed to hear. This is Elena Vasquez. In exactly 18 hours, her gentle approach to caring for two traumatized children will either prove that love doesn't need volume or cost her the position that saved her from a lifetime of loneliness. The clock starts ticking now. Statistics don't lie, but they don't tell the whole story either. The Department of Health and Human Services reports that children who experience parental loss show 68% better emotional recovery when provided with consistent nurturing care. Tonight, you'll discover how one woman's quiet presence became louder than any words could ever be, and how her termination letter became the catalyst for a revolution in how we understand healing. In the towering glass monument of 432 Park Avenue, where the city's elite live above the clouds and below their own expectations, Elena Vasquez carried herself like a shadow that preferred the corners of rooms to their centers. At 28 years old, she had perfected the art of being present, without being noticed, helpful without being heard, essential without being acknowledged. Her references were impeccable, her background checks pristine, her qualifications impressive enough to land her the most exclusive nanny position in Manhattan. But Elena carried a secret that no resume could reveal and no interview could uncover. Words had always been her enemy. Not because she couldn't speak. Her English was flawless, her Spanish poetic, her understanding of child development graduate level impressive. Words were her enemy because they had been used as weapons against her for so long that she had learned to find safety in silence, strength in stillness, and healing in the quiet spaces between conversations. The Blackstone penthouse occupied the entire 42nd floor, a monument to success that felt more like a museum than a home. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered views of Central Park that real estate agents described as breathtaking, and children described as too high to see the dogs playing. David Blackstone had built his fortune developing communication software that connected millions of people worldwide, yet his own home felt disconnected from any warmth that might make it livable. The previous nanny, Catherine Morrison, had lasted exactly 14 days. Before her, Jessica Williams managed 6 weeks. Sarah Chen, with her early childhood education degree from Columbia, survived nearly 3 months before requesting reassignment to what she diplomatically called a better cultural fit. The agency's notes were diplomatic but clear. The Blackstone. Children required specialized care that went beyond traditional nannying experience. 7-year-old Marcus Blackstone had not spoken voluntarily to an adult in 4 months. His last words to his father were, "Mommy's not coming back, is she?" uttered the day after the funeral, followed by a silence so complete that child psychologists had begun using terms like selective mutism and trauma response in their reports. He communicated through drawings that his therapists described as emotionally sophisticated but deeply concerning. Sketches of empty houses, people with no faces, and birds with broken wings. 9-year-old Isabella Blackstone had chosen the opposite response to loss, becoming a hurricane of motion and sound that never paused long enough for grief to catch up. She spoke constantly, asked endless questions, demanded attention with the desperate energy of someone afraid that silence might swallow her whole. Her teachers reported that she couldn't sit still, couldn't focus, couldn't stop talking long enough to hear anyone else's answers to the questions she never stopped asking. The children's mother, Amanda Blackstone, had died in a car accident. 8 months earlier, a tragedy so sudden and senseless that even the city's most expensive grief counselors struggled to find words adequate for the loss. David Blackstone, whose apps facilitated conversations across languages and continents, found himself unable to communicate with his own children, drowning in a silence that felt like betrayal and noise that sounded like desperation. Elena's first day began at 6 in the morning with a handwritten note from Mr. Blackstone. The children eat breakfast at 7. Marcus prefers his toast cut diagonally. Isabella changes her mind about cereal every morning, but gets upset if you ask her to. Choose. I'll be in my office until 8, then at meetings until 6. Emergency numbers are on the refrigerator. They're good kids. They just need someone who understands that good doesn't always look the way people expect it to. What the note didn't mention was that Marcus had been awake since 4:30, sitting by his bedroom window, drawing pictures of the sunrise that no one would see. It didn't explain that Isabella had already changed clothes 6 times, trying to find an outfit that would make her feel like herself in a world that no longer felt familiar. It certainly didn't warn Elena that both children had developed an expertise in testing new caregivers, not through traditional misbehavior, but through a silence so profound and noise so overwhelming that most adults felt compelled to fill the space with corrections, suggestions, and improvements. Elena did something that none of the previous nannies had tried. She said nothing. When Marcus appeared in the kitchen doorway, his brown hair uncombed and his favorite dinosaur pajamas wrinkled from sleep, Elena simply looked up from preparing breakfast and smiled. Not the bright, encouraging smile that adults use when they're trying too hard, but the gentle, acknowledging smile that says, "I see you and you're exactly where you belong." She cut his toast diagonally, placed it on his preferred blue plate, and set it at his usual spot at the kitchen island, all without commentary or instruction. Isabella burst into the kitchen 17 minutes later, having finally settled on a purple dress with orange leggings that would have made fashion consultants weep, but made her feel brave enough to face another day. "I want Lucky Charms, but only the marshmallows, and maybe some of the cereal, but not the brown pieces because they taste like sadness. And I think sadness might be contagious, and I already have enough of my own sadness without eating someone else's sad cereal pieces." Elena poured a bowl of Lucky Charms, carefully picked out the brown pieces with a spoon, and placed the bowl in front of Isabella without comment or judgment. Then she sat down with her own cup of coffee and waited. The silence that followed wasn't empty or uncomfortable. It was full of the sound of Marcus crunching his diagonal toast and Isabella discovering that Lucky Charms without brown pieces tasted exactly like celebration should taste. Elena sipped her coffee and watched the morning light move across the kitchen walls, content to exist in the spaces between words where healing often begins. Marcus finished his toast and looked at Elena with the careful assessment of someone who had learned to evaluate adult behavior for signs of disappointment or frustration. Elena met his gaze and nodded slightly, a gesture that somehow communicated both "good job" and "you're safe here" without requiring any verbal response. He slipped off his stool and disappeared toward his room, but not before leaving his empty plate in the sink, a small act of cooperation that previous nannies had demanded, but Elena had simply made possible. Isabella finished her modified Lucky Charms and launched into a detailed explanation of why purple and orange were the best color combination in the history of colors, how her stuffed elephant Mr. Peanuts agreed with her fashion choices, and whether Elena thought that clouds were just sky sheep that had gotten lost. Elena listened to every word, nodding at appropriate moments, laughing softly at Isabella's observations about sky sheep, and never once suggesting that maybe it was time to get ready for school, or perhaps she should speak a little more quietly. By the time David Blackstone appeared in the kitchen at 7:45, both children were dressed, ready for school, and sitting at the kitchen island drawing pictures while Elena packed their lunchboxes. Marcus was sketching what appeared to be a woman sitting in a garden, her face peaceful and clearly defined. The first drawing he'd made in months that included a complete human figure. Isabella was creating an elaborate map of what she called the land of perfect breakfasts, complete with Lucky Charm mountains and diagonal toast bridges. "How did you get them ready so quickly?" David asked Elena, his voice carrying the exhaustion of a man who had fought this particular battle every morning for 8 months. Elena looked up from cutting sandwiches and said simply, "They got themselves ready. I just made breakfast." It was the first of many moments when Elena's approach would seem too simple to be effective, too quiet to be impactful, and too gentle to handle the magnitude of what these children were facing. David Blackstone, who had built an empire on the belief that communication required words, strategies, and systematic approaches, couldn't understand how someone could accomplish more by saying less. But as he watched his children gather there, backpacks without reminders, kiss him goodbye without prompting, and follow Eleanor to the elevator without resistance, he felt something he hadn't experienced in months. The possibility that maybe healing didn't have to be loud to be real. This day proceeded with a rhythm that felt both new and ancient. Elena walked the children to school, listening to Isabella's continued theories about sky sheep and cloud farming, while Marcus walked beside them, occasionally pointing to interesting things he noticed, but never feeling pressured to comment aloud. She picked them up in the afternoon, stopped at the park where Marcus could feed ducks and Isabella could practice her theory that swings were actually flying machines that hadn't learned to let go yet. Evening homework time became a quiet collaboration, rather than a nightly battle. Eleanor sat at the kitchen table with her own book, reading silently while the children worked on their assignments nearby. When Marcus struggled with a math problem, she would quietly slide a piece of scratch paper toward him and point to a different way of thinking about the numbers. When Isabella got frustrated with her handwriting practice, Elena would place her own hand over Isabella's and guide her through the letter formations, their hands moving together in silence until the words began to flow more smoothly. Dinner was prepared together, with Marcus responsible for setting the table, and Isabella in charge of choosing the music that would accompany their meal. Elena had discovered that both children were more likely to eat when they felt involved in the preparation process, when the meal felt like a collaborative creation rather than a requirement imposed by adult authority. Bedtime, which had become a 2-hour negotiation process under previous caregivers, transformed into something that resembled peace. Elena would read to both children in Marcus's room, her voice soft and steady as she brought stories to life without dramatic flourishes or character voices that might feel overwhelming. Marcus would curl up with his stuffed dinosaur, listening intently while drawing pictures, inspired by whatever story Elena was sharing. Isabella would eventually grow quiet, her endless questions settling into contented listening as the day's energy finally found a place to rest. The most remarkable change was almost invisible. Marcus began leaving his drawings on the kitchen counter, where Eleanor would find them in the morning. They were no longer pictures of empty houses and broken-winged birds. Instead, Eleanor discovered sketches of families having meals together, children playing in parks with adults watching from nearby benches, and houses with warm light glowing from every window. He never mentioned the drawings, and Elena never commented on them directly, but she would carefully place each new picture on the refrigerator, creating a gallery of healing that grew day by day. Isabella's constant chatter began to include more questions that actually paused for answers, more observations that invited conversation rather than demanded attention. She started asking Elena about her own childhood, about whether Elena had ever felt scared or sad, about what Elena liked to do when she wasn't taking care of children. The questions were still endless, but they had evolved from desperate noise into genuine curiosity about the person who had brought such quiet stability into her world. For 3 weeks, this rhythm continued. Elena arrived each morning at 6, prepared breakfast with the same gentle consistency, walked the children to school, picked them up with the same warm reliability, facilitated homework and play and dinner and bedtime with the same quiet competence that made everything feel possible. David Blackstone, whose days were filled with board meetings and product launches and strategic decisions that affected millions of users, began to notice that his evenings felt different. The apartment no longer echoed with the sounds of children struggling against bedtime routines or morning preparations. Instead, he would come home to find his children engaged in quiet activities, content in Elena's presence, exhibiting a peace that he had begun to believe might be impossible. But in the world of Manhattan's elite childcare services, quiet competence was not always valued the same way that more visible, vocal approaches were appreciated. And Elena's gentle methods, which had created such profound changes in Marcus and Isabella's daily lives, were about to face an evaluation process that measured success in ways that had nothing to do with healing and everything to do with expectations. That love should be louder, care should be more obvious, and effective childcare should look like performance rather than presence. The countdown Elena didn't know about had already begun, initiated by concerns that would challenge everything she had accomplished and force everyone involved to question whether the most powerful forms of communication might be the ones that never require words at all. 3 weeks into Elena's quiet revolution, the Blackstone household had developed rhythms that felt both miraculous and invisible. David Blackstone found himself arriving home each evening to something he had forgotten was possible, the sound of children who were content. Not the forced contentment that comes from exhaustion or entertainment, but the deep satisfaction that emerges when young hearts feel truly safe. Elena's background told a story that no employment agency could have predicted would make her perfect for the Blackstone children. Born in a small town outside Guadalajara, she had been raised by her grandmother after her parents died in a factory accident when she was 6 years old. Abuela Maria had been a woman who believed that love was demonstrated through consistency rather than words, through presence rather than promises. She taught Elena that the most important conversations often happened in silence, that healing required patience rather than pressure, and that sometimes the greatest gift you could give someone was simply bearing witness to their pain without trying to fix it. Elena had earned her degree in developmental psychology from a small college in New Mexico, where she discovered that her natural inclination toward quiet observation was actually a valuable therapeutic skill. Her professors noted her exceptional ability to help children feel comfortable enough to express themselves authentically, but they also suggested that she might need to develop more assertive communication strategies to succeed in traditional childcare environments. Elena had tried to follow their advice during her early career, forcing herself to be more talkative, more directive, more visibly engaged in the ways that agencies and parents seemed to expect. The results had been consistently disappointing. Children seemed to withdraw when she tried to be more animated. Parents appreciated her educational credentials, but often commented that she seemed a bit too serious or not quite energetic enough for their family's needs. Elena had begun to believe that perhaps she wasn't suited for working with children, despite the fact that every child in her care eventually began to flourish under her gentle attention. The Blackstone position had been her last attempt before considering a career change entirely. The agency had been honest about the challenges. 2 children dealing with profound grief, a father overwhelmed by single parenthood, a household where previous nannies had struggled to establish any sustainable routines. They needed someone who could handle difficult behaviors, they explained. Someone who wouldn't be intimidated by children who were acting out or shutting down. What they hadn't mentioned was that Marcus and Isabella weren't acting out or shutting down because they were difficult children. They were responding to grief in the ways that made sense to their young nervous systems. Marcus by retreating to the safety of silence, Isabella by creating enough noise to drown out the echoes of loss that seemed to follow her everywhere. Elena recognized their responses immediately because she had lived them herself. After her parents' death, she had spent months speaking only when absolutely necessary, finding that words seemed too small and fragile to carry the weight of what she was feeling. She understood Marcus's drawings because she had filled notebooks with her own pictures during those early months of grief, images that told stories her voice couldn't manage to speak. She recognized Isabella's constant chatter because she remembered her own period of frantic talking, months when she had narrated every moment of her day to her grandmother, as if words could build a bridge across the silence that threatened to swallow her whole. But Elena also understood something that the grief counselors and child psychologists hadn't quite grasped. Healing doesn't happen on anyone's timeline, but its own. And it rarely looks the way adults expect it to look. Marcus didn't need to be coaxed into talking. He needed to know that his silence was acceptable until words felt safe again. Isabella didn't need to be encouraged to calm down. She needed to know that her voice was welcome until the world felt stable enough for quiet moments to return. Tut. Morning routine that Elena had established wasn't revolutionary in its complexity. It was revolutionary in its simplicity. She arrived each day at 6 o'clock, not because the children needed supervision at that hour, but because she had discovered that Marcus was often awake and sitting by his window, watching the city wake up. Rather than encouraging him to go back to sleep or asking him why he was awake so early, Elena would quietly prepare coffee for herself and warm milk for him, then sit in the living room reading while he continued his morning observation ritual. These early morning moments had become Marcus's favorite part of each day. Elena never asked him what he was thinking about, or suggested that he might want to talk about his feelings. Instead, she simply existed in the same space, providing the comfort of reliable presence without the pressure of expected interaction. Sometimes Marcus would bring his sketchpad to the living room and draw while Elena read. Sometimes he would simply sit on the couch nearby, finding peace in the knowledge that someone else was awake and calm in the early morning hours when the world felt most fragile. Isabella, who typically woke up with the energy of someone who had been storing conversations, overnight found in Elena an audience who could appreciate her morning observations without trying to direct or moderate them. Elena had learned that Isabella's seemingly random chatter was actually a sophisticated way of processing emotions and experiences that felt too big for her 9-year-old understanding. When Isabella announced that she thought Tuesday was definitely a purple day because purple felt like the color that hugs make, when they're really good hugs, Elena would nod thoughtfully and ask follow-up questions that helped Isabella explore what made Tuesday feel particularly hug-like. The school pickup routine had evolved into something that both children eagerly anticipated. Elena would arrive 15 minutes early and position herself where both Marcus and Isabella could see her from their respective classroom windows. Marcus, who often felt overwhelmed by the chaos of dismissal time, could spot Elena's calm presence. and feel his shoulders relax before he even reached her. Isabella, who usually exploded out of school with 12 different stories about her day, could see Elena waiting with the patient attention that made every story feel worth telling. Their afternoon walks home had become mobile therapy sessions disguised as casual conversation. Elena had discovered that both children were more likely to share difficult feelings when they were moving, when they didn't have to make eye contact, when the conversation could flow around the rhythm of their steps rather than the pressure of sitting still and talking about emotions. Marcus would occasionally point to things that reminded him of his mother, a woman walking a small dog similar to the one they used to have, a flower vendor selling the white roses that had always been his mother's favorite. Elena would acknowledge these observations with gentle nods, sometimes sharing a brief memory of her own grandmother, creating space for grief to exist without trying to fix or explain it away. Isabella used their walking time to work through the social complexities of third grade, which often felt more challenging than any academic subject. Elena listened to detailed reports about playground politics, hurt feelings, confusion over changing friendships, and the particular cruelty that children can inflict without understanding the lasting impact of their words. Rather than offering solutions or trying to minimize Isabella's concerns, Elena would ask questions that helped Isabella think through different perspectives and develop her own strategies for navigating difficult social situations. Homework time had transformed from a daily battle into a collaborative learning experience. Elena had recognized that both children struggled with focus and motivation, not because they lacked intelligence or capability, but because traditional homework approaches felt overwhelming in the context of their grief. Marcus found it difficult to concentrate when he felt isolated, but he thrived when Elena sat nearby reading her own book, providing companionship without surveillance. Isabella needed movement and variety to maintain focus, so Elena had created a homework routine that included writing while standing at the kitchen counter, math problems solved while sitting on an exercise ball, and reading time spent curled up in different locations around the apartment. Evening meal preparation had become a family collaboration that addressed multiple needs simultaneously. Marcus, who often felt anxious about making choices, found comfort in having specific, predictable responsibilities, like setting the table and choosing which vegetables to include with dinner. Isabella, who craved creative control, was put in charge of selecting music and arranging food on plates in ways that she deemed aesthetically pleasing and nutritionally colorful. Elena managed the actual cooking while facilitating conversations that allowed both children to feel heard and involved without overwhelming either of them with too many decisions. The bedtime routine Elena had established honored both children's different relationships with sleep and quiet time. Marcus, who often felt scared in the darkness that reminded him of the night they learned about his mother's accident, needed a routine that created security and predictability. Elena would read the same 3 books in the same order every night, using the same gentle voice that had become as comforting as any lullaby. Isabella, whose anxiety often manifested as difficulty settling down for sleep, needed a routine that gradually reduced stimulation and activity. Elena would begin their bedtime routine with gentle stretching exercises, move to quiet conversation about the day's positive moments, then conclude with stories that were specifically chosen for their peaceful, hopeful endings. But perhaps the most significant change was one that David Blackstone observed but couldn't quite articulate. His children were beginning to laugh again. Not the forced laughter that adults sometimes encourage when they're trying too hard to create joy, but the spontaneous laughter that emerges when children feel safe enough to find genuine delight in everyday moments. Marcus's laughter was quiet and surprised, usually triggered by something unexpected that Elena had noticed or a gentle joke that acknowledged his perspective without mocking it. Isabella's laughter was generous and infectious, often sparked by Elena's willingness to see the world through Isabella's creative, unconventional lens. Elena had also begun to understand David Blackstone's own struggle with grief and single parenthood. She observed that he often came home from work carrying tension that seemed to involve much more than business stress. He would hug his children with the desperate gratitude of someone who feared that love was too fragile to trust, and he would ask about their day with the careful attention of someone who was trying to monitor for signs of emotional distress that might require professional intervention. Elena began leaving brief handwritten notes for David, not about problems or concerns, but about small moments of joy or progress that he might have missed during his long workdays. Marcus drew a picture of the three of you having a picnic in Central Park. He included your favorite sandwich. Isabella spent 20 minutes explaining why she thinks math is actually just a secret language that numbers use to tell stories. About friendship, both children asked if we could plan a surprise for you this weekend. They want to cook dinner and create a gratitude ceremony for all the things you do for them. These notes served multiple purposes. They kept David connected to his children's daily experiences. They highlighted positive developments that might have been overshadowed by his own grief and worry, and they demonstrated Elena's deep attention to the family dynamics that extended beyond her official childcare responsibilities. David began saving these notes, reading them during particularly difficult moments at work, finding in Elena's observations a perspective on his children that helped him see beyond their grief to the resilient, creative, loving individuals they were becoming. The transformation was so gradual and gentle that it almost escaped notice. Marcus began speaking more often, not in response to pressure or encouragement, but because Elena had created an environment where his words felt valuable when he chose to share them. Isabella's constant chatter evolved into more thoughtful conversation, not because anyone had asked her to calm down, but because Elena's listening was so genuine that Isabella began to value the quality of their communication over the quantity of her words. Both children were sleeping better, eating more consistently, engaging more positively with their schoolwork, and demonstrating the kind of emotional resilience that child development experts describe as post-traumatic growth, the ability to find strength and wisdom through the process of healing from loss. Elena had created these changes not through any complex therapeutic interventions or structured behavioral modifications, but through the simple practice of meeting each child exactly where they were and providing the steady, reliable presence that allowed their own natural healing abilities to emerge. But Elena's success was about to face its greatest challenge. The very qualities that had made her so effective with Marcus and Isabella, her quiet approach, her preference for subtle rather than obvious interventions, her belief that healing happened in relationship rather than through techniques, were exactly the qualities that would soon be misinterpreted as inadequacy by people who believed that good childcare should be more visible, more measurable, and more aligned with traditional expectations about what effective communication and care should look like. The evaluation that would change everything was already being scheduled, initiated by concerns that had nothing to do with the children's well-being and everything to do with assumptions about what competent childcare was supposed to sound like. The first crack in Elena's carefully constructed world appeared on a Thursday morning in the form of an unexpected visitor. Dr. Margaret Whitfield, the child psychologist who had been monitoring Marcus and Isabella's progress since their mother's death, arrived for what she called a routine check-in, but what felt more like an inspection. Elena had been preparing breakfast when the doorbell rang at 7:15, 15 minutes before David typically left for work. Dr. Whitfield was a woman who commanded attention the moment she entered any room. Her voice carried the authority of someone accustomed to being the smartest person in professional settings. Her questions were precise and purposeful, and her observations were delivered with the confidence of someone who had spent 30 years diagnosing childhood behavioral patterns. She had earned her reputation as Manhattan's premier child trauma specialist by helping dozens of families navigate impossible losses. But her approach relied heavily on measurable interventions, documented progress, and therapeutic strategies that could be clearly articulated and systematically implemented. "I wanted to observe the morning routine," Dr. Whitfield explained to David, though her eyes were already cataloguing every detail of Eleanor's interaction with the children. "The reports from school have been remarkably positive, which is wonderful, but I want to ensure that the improvements we're seeing are sustainable and appropriately supported." Elena felt her stomach tighten as she recognized the subtext beneath Dr. Whitfield's professional language. This wasn't a celebration of progress. This was an evaluation of whether Elena's methods met the standards that Dr. Whitfield considered professionally adequate. Elena continued preparing breakfast, acutely aware that every movement was being analyzed for evidence of competence or inadequacy. Marcus appeared in the kitchen doorway, his hair still messy from sleep, carrying the stuffed dinosaur that had become his morning companion. He paused when he saw Dr. Whitfield, his expression shifting from sleepy contentment to the careful wariness that Elena recognized as his protective response to unfamiliar adult attention. Rather than greeting Dr. Whitfield or explaining who she was, Elena simply smiled at Marcus and gestured toward his usual spot at the kitchen island, where his diagonally cut toast was waiting on the blue plate he preferred. Dr. Whitfield made a note on her tablet. Elena couldn't see what she had written, but she could feel the weight of professional judgment being recorded. Isabella burst into the kitchen with her typical morning energy, wearing an outfit that combined stripes, polka dots, and solid colors, in a way that defied conventional fashion sense, but perfectly expressed her 9-year-old creativity. She launched immediately into her morning observations. "Elena, I think today feels like a yellow day because the sunshine is being extra cheerful, and also because my dream last night was about giant sunflowers that could talk, and they were having a very important conversation about whether happiness is actually a vitamin that grows inside people when they feel safe." Elena nodded thoughtfully as she always did and asked, "What did the sunflowers decide about happiness vitamins?" "They decided that happiness vitamins are definitely real, but they only work when you're around people who listen to sunflower dreams without thinking they're silly," Isabella replied, settling into her chair and beginning her careful examination of the Lucky Charms bowl that Eleanor had prepared with the brown pieces already removed. Dr. Whitfield made another note, this time with a slight frown that suggested Isabella's elaborate morning commentary might be concerning rather than charming. Elena felt a cold recognition that Dr. Whitfield was interpreting Isabella's creative communication style as evidence of continued emotional instability rather than the natural expression of a bright child processing her world through imagination and metaphor. "Isabella," Dr. Whitfield interjected, "how are you feeling about starting your day? Are you excited about school? Any worries or concerns about today?" Isabella looked up from her cereal, clearly confused by the sudden shift from dream sunflowers to direct emotional inquiry. I feel like cereal tastes better when you don't have to think about feelings while you're eating it," she said honestly, then looked at Elena with an expression that asked for help navigating this unexpected interrogation. Elena recognized that Dr. Whitfield was conducting an informal assessment, but she also understood that Isabella needed space to finish her breakfast, without the pressure of therapeutic questioning. "Would you like me to pack your library book in your backpack today?" Elena asked Isabella gently, redirecting the conversation back to practical morning concerns. Dr. Whitfield's frown deepened. She seemed to interpret Elena's intervention as avoidance rather than protection, missing the fact that Isabella visibly relaxed when the focus shifted away from emotional analysis and back to the comforting routine of morning preparation. Marcus finished his toast and brought his plate to the sink, as had become his habit. Dr. Whitfield seized this moment as an opportunity for direct engagement. "Marcus, you're being very helpful this morning. Can you tell me how you're feeling about school today? Are you looking forward to seeing your friends?" Marcus froze, his hand still on the plate he had just placed in the sink. Elena could see his shoulders tense as he struggled with the familiar adult expectation that he should provide verbal responses to emotional questions. She watched him glance toward her, seeking the reassurance that his silence would be accepted rather than challenged. "Marcus is excellent at taking care of his breakfast dishes," Elena said calmly, acknowledging his helpfulness without requiring him to respond to Dr. Whitfield's questions. "Would you like to choose which jacket to wear today?" Dr. Whitfield made a longer note this time, and Elena could sense disapproval in the rapid movement of her fingers across the tablet screen. Elena was providing Marcus with an escape from verbal pressure, but Dr. Whitfield was interpreting this as enabling avoidance rather than respecting his communication style. The observation continued through the remainder of the morning routine. Dr. Whitfield watched Elena pack lunchboxes without asking the children about their food preferences, help Isabella choose accessories for her creative outfit without commenting on the unconventional combinations, and prepare backpacks without requiring the children to verbally confirm their readiness for school. To Elena, these actions represented respectful efficiency that honored the children's autonomy. To Dr. Whitfield, they appeared to represent missed opportunities for therapeutic communication and emotional development. The walk to school became an even more uncomfortable evaluation. Dr. Whitfield accompanied Elena and the children, ostensibly to observe their interaction in a different environment, but her presence changed the entire dynamic of their usual morning journey. Isabella, who typically used their walk time to share observations about the city waking up around them, became self-conscious and unusually quiet. Marcus, who often pointed out interesting architectural details or watched for the various dogs they had learned to recognize on their route, walked with the careful tension of someone who felt watched and measured. Elena tried to maintain their usual rhythm, pointing out the window box garden that Isabella had been monitoring for new flower growth, pausing at the corner where Marcus liked to watch the intersection's carefully choreographed traffic patterns. But Dr. Whitfield's questions kept interrupting their natural flow. "Isabella, what do you think about those flowers?" "Marcus, are you interested in traffic patterns? Can you tell me what you're thinking about?" By the time they reached the school, both children seemed relieved to escape into their classrooms, away from the analytical attention that had transformed their peaceful morning routine into what felt like a prolonged examination. Elena hugged each child goodbye as she always did, but she could feel Dr. Whitfield cataloguing even these moments of affection for evidence of appropriate boundaries and professional behavior. The walk back to the apartment was when Dr. Whitfield delivered her preliminary assessment. "Elena, I have some concerns about the children's communication patterns," she began, her voice carrying the careful tone that professionals use when they're about to suggest significant changes. "Marcus is still exhibiting significant selective mutism, and Isabella's fantasy-based communication suggests ongoing difficulty processing reality-based emotions. I'm not seeing the kind of therapeutic progress that I would expect after 3 weeks of intensive daily support." Elena felt her heart sink as she recognized the fundamental misunderstanding that was driving Dr. Whitfield's concerns. Both children have been making remarkable progress. Elena said quietly. Marcus is speaking more each day, but in ways that feel safe and natural to him. Isabella's imagination is actually a strength. She's using creative thinking to work through complex emotions that most adults struggle to understand. But Marcus should be engaging in more direct communication by now, Dr. Whitfield continued. And Isabella's elaborate fantasies about talking sunflowers and happiness vitamins suggest that she's avoiding realistic emotional processing. They need more structured therapeutic intervention, more direct encouragement to express their feelings, verbally, more challenge to move beyond their current comfort zones. Elena realized that Dr. Whitfield was measuring the children's progress against standardized expectations for grief recovery rather than recognizing the individual healing journey that each child was navigating. She was interpreting Marcus's selective verbal communication as pathological rather than adaptive, and she was viewing Isabella's creative expression as avoidance rather than sophisticated emotional processing. I think we might need to consider adjusting your approach, Dr. Whitfield said as they reached the apartment building. The children seem very comfortable with you, which is positive, but comfort isn't the same as growth. They need more encouragement to move beyond their current patterns, more direct therapeutic support, more structured emotional work. That afternoon's pickup from school revealed the impact of the morning's evaluation. Both children seemed subdued, less spontaneous in their usual after-school sharing. Isabella, who typically exploded with stories about her day, offered only brief responses to Elena's gentle questions. Marcus, who had been gradually increasing his voluntary communication, retreated into the safer territory of nodding and pointing rather than speaking. Elena recognized that Dr. Whitfield's morning questions had reminded both children of the clinical attention that had defined the early months after their mother's death, when every conversation felt like an assessment and every emotion was analyzed for signs of appropriate or concerning development. The progress they had made in feeling normal and safe was being undermined by the return of therapeutic scrutiny that measured their healing against external standards rather than internal growth. The evening routine felt different as well. Marcus's drawings, which had been evolving toward more hopeful and complete images, reverted to simpler, safer subjects. Isabella's bedtime conversation, usually filled with elaborate stories and creative observations, became more constrained and conventional. Both children seemed to be protecting themselves from further evaluation by retreating toward behaviors that might seem more normal to adult observers. David Blackstone returned home that evening to find Elena preparing dinner with an unusual quietness that immediately caught his attention. She explained Dr. Whitfield's visit and concerns, but Elena could see David's own worry beginning to resurface. He had been so relieved by his children's obvious improvement that he hadn't questioned Elena's methods, but Dr. Whitfield's professional concerns were reactivating his own fears about whether he was providing adequate support for their recovery. Maybe. Dr. Whitfield has a point, David said reluctantly. I mean, Marcus still doesn't talk very much, and Isabella's imagination is pretty intense. Maybe they need more direct help than I realized. Elena felt the ground shifting beneath her feet as she recognized that Dr. Whitfield's assessment was planting seeds of doubt about the very approach that had been creating such positive changes. The quiet, patient methods that had allowed both children to heal at their own pace were being reframed as insufficient, passive, potentially harmful enabling of continued dysfunction. That night, Elena lay awake thinking about the fundamental disconnect between her understanding of healing and Dr. Whitfield's expectations for therapeutic progress. Elena believed that children recovered from trauma when they felt safe enough to be authentic, when their natural resilience was supported rather than directed, when their individual ways of processing difficult emotions were honored rather than corrected. Dr. Whitfield's approach seemed to assume that healing required pushing children beyond their comfort zones, encouraging them to express emotions in predetermined ways, measuring progress against standardized timelines that didn't account for individual differences. The next morning brought a phone call that confirmed Elena's worst fears. David had scheduled a follow-up meeting with Dr. Whitfield to discuss next steps for the children's care. The implication was clear. Elena's methods were being evaluated for adequacy, and changes might be necessary to ensure that Marcus and Isabella received the kind of professional support that Dr. Whitfield considered appropriate. Elena could feel the careful world she had built with the children beginning to destabilize. The trust that had taken weeks to establish was being undermined by questions about whether their progress was sufficient, whether their healing was happening quickly enough, whether Elena's gentle approach was actually helping or hindering their recovery. The crisis that was approaching would force everyone involved to choose between measurable therapeutic outcomes and immeasurable human connection, between professional standards and individual needs, between the kind of healing that could be documented and the kind of healing that could only be lived. Elena's quiet revolution was about to face its greatest test, and the children she had learned to love were about to become the battleground for competing philosophies about how broken hearts learn to trust again. The meeting that would determine Elena's future took place the following Monday in David Blackstone's home office, a space that had been designed to facilitate million-dollar business decisions, but now felt suffocatingly small for a conversation about two children's emotional well-being. Dr. Whitfield arrived precisely at 9 o'clock, carrying a leather portfolio filled with assessment forms, developmental checklists, and therapeutic recommendations that would reshape everything Elena had carefully built over the past month. Elena sat across from David's mahogany desk, her hands folded in her lap, watching Dr. Whitfield arrange documents with the methodical precision of someone preparing to deliver a diagnosis. The morning sunlight streaming through the floor-to-ceiling windows felt harsh rather than warming, illuminating. Dust particles that seemed to dance with the same nervous energy that Elena felt building in her chest. "I've completed my preliminary assessment," Dr. Whitfield began, opening a file that contained Elena's professional fate. "While the children appear comfortable with Elena's presence, I have significant concerns about the lack of measurable therapeutic progress. After 4 weeks of daily care, we should be seeing more substantial improvements in Marcus's verbal communication and more realistic emotional processing from Isabella." David leaned forward in his chair, his expression caught between the relief he felt when he saw his children's obvious contentment and the growing worry that he might not be providing them with adequate professional support. "What exactly are you recommending?" he asked. Dr. Whitfield pulled out a detailed treatment plan that she had prepared overnight. "I believe the children need more structured therapeutic intervention. Marcus should be participating in weekly play therapy sessions designed specifically to address selective mutism. Isabella needs cognitive behavioral therapy to help her distinguish between fantasy-based coping mechanisms and reality-based emotional processing. Additionally, I recommend that their daily caregiver receive training in therapeutic communication techniques." Elena felt her stomach drop as she recognized the implication of Dr. Whitfield's recommendations. The gentle, intuitive approach that had allowed both children to begin healing was being pathologized as inadequate, unprofessional, potentially harmful to their long-term recovery. The suggestion that she needed training in therapeutic communication techniques felt like a fundamental rejection of everything she understood about how children heal from trauma. "Elena has been wonderful with the children," David said carefully, glancing at Elena with an expression that mixed gratitude with uncertainty. They seem happier than they've been since their mother died. But if you think they need more specialized help—" "Comfort isn't the same as healing," Dr. Whitfield interrupted. "Children experiencing trauma often gravitate toward caregivers who don't challenge them to grow beyond their current coping mechanisms. Elena's approach may feel good to the children, but it's not necessarily helping them develop the skills they need for long-term emotional health." Elena found her voice, though it came out quieter than she intended. "Both children have made remarkable progress. Marcus has begun drawing pictures that include complete human figures again. Isabella's creative thinking is helping her process emotions that most adults struggle to understand. They're sleeping better, eating consistently, engaging with their schoolwork, laughing again." Dr. Whitfield consulted her notes, her expression suggesting that Elena's observations were either irrelevant or misguided. Those improvements could be temporary responses to novelty rather than sustainable therapeutic gains. Marcus's continued selective mutism is concerning, and Isabella's elaborate fantasy narratives suggest ongoing difficulty with reality testing. Without more direct intervention, these patterns could become entrenched and interfere with their social and academic development. The conversation continued for another 30 minutes, with Dr. Whitfield systematically deconstructing every aspect of Elena's approach. Her morning routine was described as enabling avoidance behaviors. Her patient response to Marcus's silence was characterized as failing to provide appropriate communication challenges. Her appreciation for Isabella's imagination was reframed as reinforcing maladaptive coping mechanisms. Elena listened to her methods being translated into clinical language that stripped away all recognition of the relationship-based healing that had been occurring. Dr. Whitfield spoke about the children as if they were collections of symptoms, to be managed rather than whole human beings learning to trust the world again after experiencing devastating loss. "I think we should implement these recommendations," David said finally, his voice heavy with the weight of parental responsibility. "I want to make sure Marcus and Isabella get everything they need to recover completely." Elena realized that her position was becoming untenable. She could either accept Dr. Whitfield's therapeutic framework, which would require her to abandon everything she believed about how children heal, or she could continue using her own approach, while being constantly evaluated for evidence of professional inadequacy. Neither option would serve the children's best interests. "I understand your concerns," Elena said quietly, "but I believe that healing happens in relationship, not through techniques. Marcus and Isabella have been showing me who they are when they feel safe, and they're remarkable children who are processing their grief in ways that honor both their loss and their resilience." Dr. Whitfield's expression suggested that Elena's perspective was both naive and potentially harmful. Trauma recovery requires evidence-based interventions, not intuitive caregiving. These children need professional support, not just emotional comfort. The meeting ended with a plan that felt like a slow-motion disaster. Elena would continue as the children's nanny, but under Dr. Whitfield's supervision and with mandatory weekly training sessions on therapeutic communication techniques. Marcus and Isabella would begin individual therapy sessions twice weekly, with their progress measured against standardized developmental milestones. The spontaneous, relationship-based healing that had been occurring would be replaced by structured, measurable, professionally supervised interventions. Elena left the office feeling as if she had just witnessed the systematic dismantling of everything she had built with Marcus and Isabella. The trust they had developed, the safety they had created together, the natural rhythm of healing that had begun to emerge, all of it was about to be subjected to therapeutic analysis that would inevitably change its essential character. That afternoon's pickup from school revealed the first signs of the approaching crisis. Elena arrived to find Marcus standing by himself near the school entrance. his usual peaceful demeanor replaced by the anxious watchfulness that she remembered from their first days together. Isabella emerged from her classroom with less energy than usual, her creative observations about the day replaced by simple responses to Eleanor's gentle questions. During their walk home, Eleanor realized that both children had somehow sensed the morning's evaluation of their progress. Children who have experienced trauma develop sophisticated radar for adult anxiety, and they had clearly detected the shift in how their healing was being perceived and measured. Marcus began exhibiting behaviors that Eleanor hadn't seen in weeks. Checking over his shoulder, walking closer to Elena as if seeking protection, retreating into the careful silence that had characterized his early grief response. Isabella's response was equally telling. Her usual stream of creative commentary was replaced by more conventional observations, designed to demonstrate that she was paying attention to real things rather than indulging in fantasy-based thinking. "Look, Elena, that tree has green leaves, and that car is silver, and that dog is walking on a leash with its owner," she said with forced normalcy that broke Elena's heart. The afternoon homework session became a painful reminder of how quickly therapeutic pressure could undermine natural healing. Marcus, who had been gradually increasing his willingness to ask questions when he needed help, reverted to struggling silently rather than risking verbal communication that might be analyzed for evidence of progress or pathology. Isabella, who had developed a creative approach to completing assignments that incorporated movement and imagination, began sitting rigidly at the kitchen table, trying to demonstrate the kind of focused attention that adults seem to expect. Elena found herself caught in an impossible position. She could see that both children were beginning to monitor their own behavior for evidence of appropriate healing, but she knew that self-consciousness about recovery was antithetical to authentic emotional growth. The more they tried to demonstrate progress according to adult expectations, the further they moved away from the genuine healing that had been occurring when they felt free to be themselves. Dinner preparation that evening lacked the collaborative joy that had become their routine. Marcus set the table with mechanical precision rather than the thoughtful attention that had characterized his recent contributions. Isabella chose music that was pleasant and conventional rather than the eclectic selections that had reflected her unique personality. Both children seemed to be performing normalcy rather than living it. The bedtime routine revealed the full extent of the damage that therapeutic evaluation had already caused. Marcus's drawings had become simpler and safer, lacking the emotional complexity and hopeful details that had marked his recent artistic expression. Isabella's bedtime stories were shorter and more realistic, missing the elaborate imaginative narratives that had helped her process difficult emotions through creative metaphor. Elena read to them as she always had, but she could feel the careful distance that both children were creating to protect themselves from further assessment. They were still physically present, still responsive to her care, but they had begun the emotional withdrawal that children use when they sense that their authentic selves are being evaluated rather than accepted. That night, Elena made a decision that would change everything. She could not continue to provide care under conditions that required her to abandon everything she believed about healing. She could not watch Marcus and Isabella retreat from the progress they had made because their natural recovery process was being pathologized as inadequate. She could not participate in a therapeutic framework that measured their worth based on their ability to demonstrate improvement according to standardized timelines. Elena spent hours that night writing a letter that she knew would end her employment, but that she hoped might protect the children from further therapeutic damage. She wrote about Marcus's remarkable artistic development, Isabella's sophisticated emotional intelligence, the trust they had built together, the laughter that had returned to their daily routine, the peace that had replaced the anxiety that had defined their early grief response. But more importantly, she wrote about what would be lost if their healing was forced into a therapeutic framework that pathologized their individual ways of processing trauma. She explained how Marcus's selective verbal communication was actually a strength that allowed him to process emotions without the pressure of performing normalcy for adult comfort. She described how Isabella's imaginative narratives were sophisticated coping mechanisms that honored both her loss and her resilience. Elena's letter was her attempt to advocate for the children's right to heal in ways that felt authentic to them rather than convenient for adult measurement. She knew that submitting the letter would likely result in her termination, but she also knew that staying silent would make her complicit in therapeutic approaches that could undermine the very progress she had been hired to support. The next morning would bring Elena's final stand for the children she had learned to love, a confrontation that would force everyone involved to choose between professional protocols and human wisdom, between measurable outcomes and immeasurable healing, between the safety of standardized approaches and the courage required to trust that children know how to heal when they feel truly seen and accepted. Elena placed the letter on David's desk before dawn, knowing that within hours she would either find a way to protect Marcus and Isabella's natural healing process or lose the opportunity to advocate for them entirely. The countdown to her decision had reached 0, and everything that happened next would depend on whether one father could choose his children's authentic well-being over professional reassurance that their recovery was proceeding according to expert expectations. David Blackstone discovered Elena's letter at 6:30 Tuesday morning, placed precisely in the center of his desk, where he couldn't possibly miss it. The envelope was addressed simply, "For Marcus and Isabella's father," in Elena's careful handwriting, and something about the formality of the address made his stomach tighten with apprehension. He had been expecting a resignation letter since yesterday's meeting with Dr. Whitfield, but he wasn't prepared for the 8 pages of detailed observations that Elena had written through the night. The letter began with a simple statement that hit David like a physical blow. "I am writing this letter because I love Marcus and Isabella too much to watch their healing be dismantled by people who mistake recovery for compliance with therapeutic expectations." Elena proceeded to document every moment of progress that Dr. Whitfield had dismissed as insignificant, every breakthrough that had been reframed as inadequate, every sign of returning joy that had been pathologized as avoidance. She wrote about Marcus's first voluntary laugh, which had occurred 3 weeks earlier when Elena had accidentally dropped a piece of toast, and he had quietly observed that gravity seemed to have very strong opinions about breakfast food. She described the evolution of his drawings from empty houses to detailed scenes of family life, the gradual increase in his willingness to make eye contact, the way he had begun humming while completing homework assignments. These weren't symptoms to be analyzed, Elena argued, but evidence of a child learning to trust the world again. Elena's observations about Isabella were equally detailed and heartbreaking. She documented the gradual transformation of Isabella's frantic chatter from desperate noise into genuine communication, the sophisticated, emotional intelligence hidden within her imaginative narratives. The way her elaborate stories about talking sunflowers and friendship mathematics actually demonstrated advanced processing of complex social and emotional concepts. Dr. Whitfield had interpreted Isabella's creativity as pathological fantasy, but Elena saw it as evidence of a brilliant mind that was using every available resource to make sense of devastating loss. The letter continued with Elena's analysis of what would happen if Marcus and Isabella were forced into traditional therapeutic frameworks that prioritize measurable progress over individual healing styles. She predicted that Marcus would retreat further into silence to protect himself from pressure to perform verbal communication before he felt emotionally ready. She warned that Isabella would learn to suppress her natural creativity in favor of responses that adults deemed more appropriate, losing access to the imaginative resources that were helping her process grief. But the most powerful section of Elena's letter was her description of what she had witnessed during the previous day, after Dr. Whitfield's evaluation had introduced therapeutic surveillance into the children's daily experience. Both children had immediately begun monitoring their own behavior for evidence of appropriate recovery, transforming their natural healing process into a performance designed to meet adult expectations. Marcus had stopped drawing pictures that reflected his authentic emotions, creating instead simple, safe images that couldn't be analyzed for concerning content. Isabella had abandoned the elaborate storytelling that had been helping her work through difficult feelings, offering conventional observations that demonstrated her ability to distinguish fantasy from reality. Elena wrote, "When children who are healing from trauma begin to perform recovery rather than live it, they lose access to the very resources that could help them integrate their loss and move forward with resilience. Marcus and Isabella are not broken children who need to be fixed according to professional protocols. They are whole human beings who are learning to carry their grief with grace, and they deserve caregivers who can witness their healing without trying to control its timeline or appearance." David read the letter 3 times before 7 o'clock, each reading revealing new layers of insight about his children's experience that he had completely missed. Elena's observations forced him to recognize that his own anxiety about providing adequate support had made him vulnerable to professional recommendations that pathologized his children's natural recovery process. He had been so desperate to ensure that Marcus and Isabella received appropriate help that he had forgotten to trust his own observations about their obvious improvement. At 7:15, Marcus appeared in the kitchen for breakfast, and David found himself seeing his son through Elena's eyes rather than Dr. Whitfield's clinical assessment. Marcus moved through the morning routine with quiet confidence, checking to make sure his favorite stuffed dinosaur was properly positioned on his bed before leaving for school, pointing out an interesting cloud formation through the window, offering Elena a shy smile when she complimented his choice of shirt for the day. These weren't symptoms of selective mutism that required therapeutic intervention. These were signs of a child who was learning to engage with the world again at his own pace. Isabella's morning performance was equally revealing. She greeted David with her usual hug and launched into a detailed explanation of why Tuesday felt like a day that needed extra kindness, because kindness was like vitamin C for feelings, and Tuesday seemed to have a vitamin C deficiency based on how grey the sky looked. David realized that Isabella's elaborate metaphors weren't evidence of difficulty processing reality. They were demonstrations of sophisticated emotional intelligence that allowed her to understand abstract concepts through concrete imagery. Elena prepared breakfast with her usual gentle efficiency, but David could see new tension in her movements. She was preparing to implement Dr. Whitfield's recommendations, which would require her to interrupt the children's natural communication patterns with therapeutic questioning, to redirect Isabella's imaginative observations toward more conventional expressions, to encourage Marcus to verbalize emotions that he was already processing through other means. David watched Elena struggle with the impossible position of providing care that contradicted everything she believed about healing. When Marcus finished his breakfast and brought his plate to the sink without being asked, Elena began to say something that sounded like therapeutic encouragement. "That's excellent communication through your actions, Marcus," then stopped herself, recognizing that analyzing his helpfulness would transform a natural gesture into a performance of appropriate behavior. Isabella began sharing her observations about the morning light, describing how sunshine seemed to be wearing its friendliest outfit today when Elena interrupted with a question that Dr. Whitfield had recommended. "Isabella, can you tell me 3 realistic things you notice about the morning?" The question was designed to redirect Isabella's imaginative processing toward concrete observation, but it had the immediate effect of making Isabella self-conscious about her natural way of understanding the world. David realized that he was watching Elena provide care that violated her professional instincts and personal beliefs about childhood healing. She was implementing therapeutic techniques that required her to correct rather than appreciate the children's individual communication styles, to measure their progress against standardized expectations rather than honor their unique recovery journey. The walk to school became an exercise in therapeutic intervention rather than the collaborative exploration that had characterized their previous morning routines. Elena asked Marcus direct questions about his feelings and school expectations, questions that made him visibly uncomfortable because they required him to verbalize internal experiences that he was still learning to trust. She redirected Isabella's creative observations about the city waking up toward factual descriptions that demonstrated her ability to focus on concrete rather than imaginative details. Both children adapted to these changes with the heartbreaking compliance that traumatized children develop to protect themselves from adult disapproval. Marcus answered Elena's questions with brief, careful responses that provided the minimum verbal communication required without revealing his authentic, emotional state. Isabella modified her natural storytelling to include more realistic details and fewer imaginative elements, demonstrating that she could distinguish between fantasy and reality, even though doing so diminished her access to the creative resources that had been helping her process grief. David followed behind them during the walk to school, maintaining enough distance that the children weren't aware of his presence, but close enough to observe their interaction with Elena. He watched his children transform from the spontaneous, gradually healing individuals they had become under Elena's original approach into careful performers, trying to demonstrate appropriate recovery according to therapeutic expectations. At school drop-off, David observed something that Elena's letter had prepared him to recognize. Marcus hugged Elena goodbye with less warmth than usual, not because he cared about her less, but because their relationship was being transformed from authentic connection into therapeutic alliance. Isabella's goodbye was similarly affected. Still affectionate but tinged with the careful attention of someone who was learning to monitor her own behavior for evidence of appropriate emotional expression. Elena walked back toward the apartment with David, and he could see that implementing Dr. Whitfield's recommendations was causing her genuine distress. She had spent the morning providing care that contradicted everything she understood about supporting children's natural healing abilities, and the results were already visible in Marcus and Isabella's increased self-consciousness about their recovery process. "This isn't working," David said finally, voicing what both he and Elena could see but hadn't yet acknowledged directly. "They were better yesterday morning before we started trying to make them better." Elena stopped walking and turned to face David with an expression that mixed relief with apprehension. "They don't need to be fixed according to professional protocols," she said quietly. "They need to be seen and accepted for who they are while they're learning to carry their loss. Marcus and Isabella are not broken children. They're resilient, children who are healing in ways that honor both their grief and their strength." David realized that Elena's letter had articulated something that he had felt but couldn't express. His children were not collections of symptoms requiring therapeutic management. but whole human beings who deserved caregivers capable of witnessing their healing without trying to control its appearance or timeline. Dr. Whitfield's recommendations, however well-intentioned, were based on the assumption that standardized therapeutic approaches were superior to individualized, relationship-based healing. "What do you think we should do?" David asked, recognizing that Elena's insight into his children's emotional needs was more valuable than any professional assessment that reduced them to diagnostic categories. Elena hesitated, clearly aware that her recommendation would contradict Dr. Whitfield's expert opinion and potentially put her employment at risk. "I think we should trust Marcus and Isabella to show us what they need, rather than imposing therapeutic expectations that may not serve their individual healing process. I think we should create space for them to recover in ways that feel authentic, rather than performing recovery according to adult timelines." David found himself at a crossroads that would determine not only Eleanor's employment, but his children's emotional future. He could continue following Dr. Whitfield's recommendations, implementing therapeutic interventions that carried the authority of professional expertise, but seemed to be undermining his children's natural recovery. Or he could trust Elena's relationship-based approach, which had produced obvious improvements in his children's daily functioning, but lacked the systematic framework that professional standards seemed to require. The decision would need to be made quickly. Dr. Whitfield expected a report on Elena's implementation of therapeutic communication techniques by the end of the week. Marcus and Isabella deserved clarity about whether their healing would be supported or subjected to continued analysis. Elena needed to know whether she could provide authentic care or would be required to continue implementing approaches that violated her understanding of childhood recovery. Standing on the sidewalk outside their apartment building, David realized that choosing Elena's approach would require him to trust his own observations about his children's well-being over professional reassurance that their recovery was proceeding according to expert expectations. It would mean prioritizing Marcus and Isabella's authentic healing over measurable therapeutic outcomes, relationship over technique, individual needs over standardized protocols. The confrontation that would determine everything was about to begin, initiated by a father's growing recognition that love might be more therapeutic than therapy, that healing might be more about acceptance than analysis, and that sometimes the most professional thing to do is trust children to show adults what they need, rather than imposing adult expectations about what childhood recovery should look like. The emergency meeting that would reshape the Blackstone family's future was scheduled for that same Tuesday afternoon, initiated by David's growing certainty that professional expertise was not necessarily equivalent to his children's best interests. He had spent the morning researching childhood trauma recovery, reading studies that Eleanor had referenced in her letter, and discovering a body of research that supported relationship-based healing approaches over rigid therapeutic protocols. The evidence was compelling, but more importantly, his own observations of Marcus and Isabella's regression under therapeutic surveillance had convinced him that Eleanor's gentle methods were being unfairly pathologized. Dr. Whitfield arrived at 2 o'clock with additional documentation supporting her recommendations, including standardized assessment forms that would measure Marcus and Isabella's progress against developmental milestones that seemed disconnected from their individual healing journey. She had also prepared a revised treatment plan that included increased therapeutic interventions, structured communication exercises, and weekly evaluations that would monitor Elena's implementation of evidence-based caregiving techniques. Elena sat across from Dr. Whitfield in David's office, her resignation letter prepared but not yet submitted, waiting to see whether this meeting would create space for advocating on behalf of the children, or would simply confirm that their healing would be subjected to therapeutic management, that prioritized measurable outcomes over authentic recovery. She had decided that she would rather lose her position than participate in approaches that could undermine Marcus and Isabella's natural resilience. "I've prepared a comprehensive intervention plan," Dr. Whitfield began, spreading assessment forms across David's desk with the confidence of someone accustomed to having her professional recommendations implemented without question. Marcus will benefit from systematic desensitization techniques designed to increase his verbal communication. Isabella needs cognitive restructuring exercises to help her distinguish between adaptive and maladaptive emotional processing. Both children require more structured therapeutic boundaries in their daily interactions. David found himself looking at the assessment forms with new understanding about what Elena had been trying to communicate in her letter. The forms reduced Marcus and Isabella to collections of behavioral indicators that could be measured and modified, missing entirely the complex human beings who were learning to integrate devastating loss into their understanding of themselves and their world. Marcus's selective verbal communication was categorized as pathological avoidance rather than adaptive emotional regulation. Isabella's imaginative processing was labeled as reality distortion rather than sophisticated coping through creative metaphor. "Dr. Whitfield," David said carefully, "I've been observing the children's response to yesterday's therapeutic evaluation, and I'm concerned that analyzing their healing process is actually interfering with their recovery. They seem to be performing appropriate behavior rather than experiencing authentic emotional growth." Dr. Whitfield consulted her notes with an expression that suggested David's observations were understandable but misguided. "It's common for parents to mistake therapeutic resistance for authentic expression. Children often feel comfortable with caregivers who don't challenge their avoidance patterns, but comfort isn't the same as healing. Marcus and Isabella need professional support to move beyond their current coping mechanisms toward more adaptive emotional functioning." Elena recognized that Dr. Whitfield was interpreting any deviation from her therapeutic framework as evidence of resistance rather than consideration that her approach might not serve these particular children's needs. "Both children have been demonstrating remarkable emotional growth," Elena said quietly. "Marcus has been processing his grief through artistic expression, gradual increases in voluntary communication, and renewed engagement with daily activities. Isabella has been using creative thinking to understand complex emotions and social situations. These aren't avoidance patterns, they're sophisticated healing strategies." Dr. Whitfield opened Marcus's file and began reading from her assessment. Notes: Marcus exhibits persistent selective mutism, limited eye contact with authority figures, and preference for solitary activities over peer interaction. These patterns suggest continued trauma response that requires systematic intervention to prevent long-term social and academic difficulties. David realized that Dr. Whitfield's clinical description bore no resemblance to the child he had been observing over the past month. Marcus had been making steady eye contact with Elena and with him, engaging enthusiastically in activities that interested him, and demonstrating social awareness through his artistic expression and thoughtful responses to family interactions. The selective mutism that Dr. Whitfield described as pathological looked more like selective verbal communication based on comfort and emotional readiness. Isabella demonstrates reality distortion through elaborate fantasy narratives, difficulty maintaining focus on concrete tasks, and emotional dysregulation expressed through hyperverbal presentations. Dr. Whitfield continued, reading from Isabella's assessment. These patterns indicate continued difficulty processing her mother's death in realistic terms and suggest the need for structured reality testing interventions. Elena felt her frustration building as she listened to Isabella's sophisticated emotional intelligence being pathologized as dysfunction. Isabella's imaginative narratives demonstrate advanced emotional processing, she said, her voice stronger than before. She uses metaphor and creative thinking to understand abstract concepts like grief, resilience, and social relationships. Her verbal expressiveness isn't emotional dysregulation. It's sophisticated communication that honors both her intellectual capacity and her emotional needs. The meeting continued with Dr. Whitfield systematically deconstructing every aspect of the children's natural recovery process. Marcus's artistic expression was described as avoidance of verbal processing. Isabella's creative communication was characterized as fantasy-based denial of emotional reality. Elena's relationship-based approach was reframed as therapeutic enabling that prevented necessary emotional growth. David found himself caught between professional authority and parental instinct, between expert recommendations and his own observations of his children's obvious improvement. Dr. Whitfield's assessment carried the weight of 30 years of clinical experience, but it seemed to describe entirely different children than the ones he had been watching heal under Elena's care. "I want to understand something," David said finally. "When I look at my children now compared to 2 months ago, I see kids who are sleeping through the night, eating regularly, laughing again, engaging with their schoolwork, showing affection without anxiety. Marcus is drawing pictures that include hope rather than despair. Isabella is using her creativity to work through difficult emotions rather than being overwhelmed by them. These seem like signs of healing to me." Dr. Whitfield acknowledged David's observations, but maintained her clinical perspective. "Surface-level improvements can be misleading. Children often show temporary behavioral changes in response to novelty or reduced expectations. Without systematic therapeutic intervention, these improvements may not be sustainable. Marcus and Isabella need professional support to develop the skills necessary for long-term emotional health." Elena realized that Dr. Whitfield was operating from a fundamental assumption that childhood trauma recovery required professional management rather than supportive relationships. Her clinical training had taught her to identify pathology rather than recognize resilience, to measure progress against standardized timelines rather than honor individual healing journeys, to prioritize therapeutic techniques over authentic human connection. "What if we're wrong about what they need?" Elena asked, addressing both David and Dr. Whitfield. "What if Marcus's selective verbal communication is actually adaptive emotional regulation that allows him to process grief without performing recovery for adult comfort? What if Isabella's imaginative narratives are sophisticated coping mechanisms that help her integrate loss while maintaining access to joy and creativity?" Dr. Whitfield's expression suggested that Elena's questions revealed concerning misunderstanding about childhood trauma recovery. Professional training and clinical experience provide frameworks for understanding childhood development that go beyond intuitive caregiving. These children have experienced significant trauma, and their recovery requires evidence-based interventions implemented by qualified professionals. David felt the weight of professional authority pressing against his growing conviction that Elena understood his children in ways that clinical assessment could not capture. Dr. Whitfield's recommendations carried the safety of expert approval, but implementing them would require him to ignore his own observations about Marcus and Isabella's authentic improvement under Elena's care. The turning point came when Dr. Whitfield presented her ultimatum. Elena could continue as the children's caregiver only if she completed certification in therapeutic communication techniques and implemented structured interventions under professional supervision. Marcus and Isabella would begin intensive therapy sessions designed to address their continued trauma responses and maladaptive coping patterns. Their progress would be measured monthly against standardized developmental milestones, with adjustments to their treatment plan based on clinical assessment rather than individual needs. Elena looked at David with an expression that communicated both her love for his children and her unwillingness to provide care that contradicted everything she believed about healing. "I cannot implement therapeutic approaches that pathologize Marcus and Isabella's natural recovery process," she said quietly. "They are not broken children who need to be fixed according to professional protocols. They are resilient children who deserve caregivers capable of witnessing their healing without trying to control its timeline or appearance." David realized that he was facing a choice between professional reassurance and authentic trust, between systematic intervention and relationship-based healing, between measuring his children's recovery against external standards and honoring their individual journey toward wholeness. Dr. Whitfield offered the security of expert guidance and evidence-based treatment, but Elena offered something that felt more valuable: the ability to see Marcus and Isabella as complete human beings whose healing deserved to be supported rather than managed. The silence that followed Elena's statement stretched across the office, like a bridge that David would either cross toward trusting his children's natural resilience or burn by choosing therapeutic management over authentic relationship. Dr. Whitfield waited with the patient confidence of someone accustomed to having her professional recommendations ultimately accepted, despite temporary parental resistance. Elena sat quietly, her resignation letter ready to submit if David chose Dr. Whitfield's approach, but her hope focused on the possibility that one father might choose to trust his children's healing over professional expectations about what their recovery should look like. The decision would determine not only Elena's employment, but Marcus and Isabella's emotional future, establishing whether their healing would be supported or subjected to therapeutic surveillance that could undermine the very progress it claimed to measure. David closed his eyes and thought about his children's laughter returning, about Marcus's drawings evolving from despair to hope, about Isabella's creative communication demonstrating sophisticated emotional intelligence, about the peace that had replaced anxiety in their daily routines. When he opened his eyes, he knew what he had to choose, and the words that came next would either validate Elena's faith in relationship-based healing or confirm Dr. Whitfield's authority over his family's emotional future. David opened his eyes and looked directly at Dr. Whitfield with the quiet certainty of a man who had finally learned to trust his own observations over professional intimidation. "I have made my decision," he said, his voice carrying the weight of paternal protection rather than corporate negotiation. "Elena will continue as my children's caregiver without therapeutic supervision or mandatory training. Marcus and Isabella will not be participating in intensive therapy sessions unless they express interest in that support themselves." Dr. Whitfield's expression shifted from professional confidence to genuine surprise, then quickly to the controlled disappointment of someone unaccustomed to having her clinical recommendations rejected. "David, I need you to understand that you're potentially compromising your children's long-term emotional health. Without proper therapeutic intervention, their current trauma responses could become entrenched patterns that interfere with their social, academic, and emotional development throughout their lives." David felt the familiar weight of expert authority, attempting to override his parental instincts, but Elena's letter had given him language for what he had been observing without being able to articulate. "Dr. Whitfield, I appreciate your professional expertise, but I've been watching my children heal in ways that your assessments don't seem to recognize or value. They're not exhibiting trauma responses, they're demonstrating resilience." Elena sat quietly, hardly daring to believe that David was choosing relationship-based healing over therapeutic management, but she could see the determination in his expression that suggested he had moved beyond seeking professional approval toward trusting his own understanding of his children's needs. This was the moment when everything would either change or crystallize into the systematic approach that would prioritize measuring recovery over supporting authentic healing. Dr. Whitfield opened her portfolio and pulled out research studies, statistical analyses, and case studies that supported her therapeutic framework. The literature on childhood trauma recovery is clear about the necessity of professional intervention. Children who experience parental loss require structured support to process their grief appropriately. Without clinical guidance, they often develop avoidance patterns, attachment difficulties, and emotional regulation problems that persist into adulthood. David looked at the papers spread across his desk and realized that none of the research studies included children who looked like Marcus and Isabella, children who were receiving consistent, patient, relationship-based care from someone who understood trauma recovery as an individual journey rather than a systematic process. The studies measured children's progress in clinical settings against standardized timelines, but they didn't account for the possibility that healing might happen differently when children felt truly seen and accepted rather than evaluated and managed. I understand the research, David said carefully, but I also understand my children. 2 months ago, Marcus hadn't spoken voluntarily to any adult in 4 months. Now he's sharing observations, asking questions, and expressing preferences. 2 months ago, Isabella's talking was desperate noise designed to prevent silence from overwhelming her. Now she's communicating thoughts and feelings that demonstrate sophisticated emotional intelligence. These changes happened under Elena's care, not despite it. Elena felt tears building behind her eyes as she listened to David articulate the progress that Dr. Whitfield had systematically dismissed as inadequate or potentially harmful. David was choosing to trust his children's natural healing process over professional protocols that would pathologize their individual recovery journey. Dr. Whitfield gathered her papers with the efficient movements of someone preparing to document. Professional disagreement for liability protection. I'll need to note in my report that you declined recommended therapeutic interventions against clinical advice. The school district will need to be informed about your decision to proceed without professional support for children who have experienced significant trauma. David recognized the implicit threat in Dr. Whitfield's statement that choosing Elena's approach over therapeutic management could result in questions about his adequacy as a parent and his children's access to appropriate educational support. But he also realized that submitting to professional intimidation would require him to abandon his growing understanding that Marcus and Isabella were healing exactly as they needed to heal. "I'll accept responsibility for that decision," David said firmly. "Elena has demonstrated more understanding of my children's emotional needs than any professional assessment has provided. I trust her judgment about what they need to continue healing." Dr. Whitfield closed her portfolio with the finality of someone severing a professional relationship. "I hope you're right, David. But if Marcus and Isabella's current patterns become entrenched and interfere with their future functioning, please remember that therapeutic support was available and declined." After Dr. Whitfield left, the office felt simultaneously lighter and heavier. Lighter because the pressure of therapeutic surveillance had been lifted. Heavier because David had chosen a path that lacked professional validation and carried the full weight of parental responsibility for his children's emotional future. Elena sat across from David, both of them processing the magnitude of what had just occurred. "Thank you," Elena said quietly, her voice thick with emotion. "You chose to trust Marcus and Isabella's healing over professional expectations about what their recovery should look like." David looked at Elena with new appreciation for the courage she had shown in advocating for his children, despite professional pressure to conform to therapeutic protocols. "You've given me back my children," he said. "I had forgotten what they looked like when they felt safe, and you reminded me that healing doesn't have to be loud or measurable to be real. The afternoon pickup from school that day felt like a celebration of authentic relationship over therapeutic management. Marcus and Isabella emerged from their classrooms to find Elena waiting with her usual warm smile, but without the careful evaluation that had characterized their interactions since Dr. Whitfield's assessment. The therapeutic surveillance that had made both children self-conscious about their recovery was gone, replaced by the patient acceptance that had originally allowed their healing to begin. During their walk home, Isabella launched into an elaborate explanation of why Wednesday felt like a day that needed extra music, because music was like emotional vitamins that helped feelings stay healthy, and Elena listened with the genuine appreciation that Isabella's creative communication deserved. Marcus pointed out architectural details that interested him, sharing observations without the pressure to demonstrate appropriate verbal communication for therapeutic documentation. Elena realized that both children immediately sensed the shift in their relationship dynamic. They were no longer being cared for under therapeutic supervision, but were returning to the authentic connection that had created space for their natural resilience to emerge. Marcus's shoulders relaxed as he walked, and Isabella's conversation flowed with the creative energy that had been constrained when she felt evaluated for evidence of appropriate reality testing. That evening, David made an announcement that would reshape their family's approach to healing entirely. Elena and I have decided that we're going to trust you both to show us what you need, rather than following rules about what other people think children should need after experiencing loss. We're going to support your healing, however it looks, however long it takes, however it changes. Marcus looked up from his dinner with an expression of relief that confirmed David's decision to reject therapeutic management in favor of relationship-based support. Isabella asked, "Does that mean I can keep talking about sky sheep and happiness vitamins without anyone worrying that I'm confused about reality?" David and Elena both laughed, and Isabella's face lit up with the joy of someone whose authentic communication style had been not just accepted, but appreciated. The bedtime routine that night felt like a return to the gentle rhythm that had been disrupted by therapeutic evaluation. Marcus's drawings had begun to include more complex emotional content again, and he showed Elena a picture of a family sitting together watching stars, with faces that were peaceful rather than worried. Isabella's bedtime story involved a grandmother cloud who helped lost raindrops find their way back to the ocean, a narrative that processed separation and reunion through metaphor that honored both loss and hope. Elena read to both children with the patient voice that had originally created safety for their healing, and she could feel them settling into the authentic relationship that made recovery possible. They were no longer performing appropriate behavior for therapeutic evaluation, but were returning to the trust that allowed them to be themselves while learning to carry their grief with grace. David spent that evening researching alternative approaches to childhood trauma support, discovering a body of literature that validated Elena's relationship-based methods and questioned the assumption that all traumatized children required intensive therapeutic intervention. He found studies demonstrating that consistent, patient, accepting relationships often produced better long-term outcomes than systematic therapeutic protocols, particularly for children who had access to stable, nurturing daily care. More importantly, David began documenting his children's progress in ways that honored their individual healing journey, rather than measuring their recovery against standardized expectations. He noted Marcus's increasing willingness to share observations and feelings, his artistic expression becoming more complex and hopeful, his physical symptoms of anxiety diminishing as he felt safer in his daily environment. He recorded Isabella's evolution from frantic communication to thoughtful expression, her creative problem-solving skills, her growing ability to comfort herself and others through imaginative narrative. The documentation David created was not designed for professional evaluation, but for his own understanding of how his children were integrating their loss and moving toward wholeness. It was evidence of healing that could not be measured by clinical assessment, but could be witnessed by people who loved Marcus and Isabella enough to trust their individual recovery process. Elena prepared a new approach to supporting the children that was freed from therapeutic constraints, but remained informed by her understanding of childhood development and trauma recovery. She would continue providing the consistent, patient, relationship-based care that had created space for their natural resilience, but without the pressure to document progress or implement interventions designed to accelerate their healing according to professional timelines. The transformation that followed David's decision to trust Elena's approach over Dr. Whitfield's therapeutic management would prove that healing happens in relationship rather than through technique, that children's natural resilience is often more therapeutic than professional intervention, and that sometimes the most professional thing to do is trust children to show adults what they need, rather than imposing adult expectations about what childhood recovery should look like. But the real test of David's decision would come in the weeks and months ahead, when Marcus and Isabella's continued healing would either validate his choice to prioritize relationship over protocol or confirm Dr. Whitfield's warnings about the dangers of declining professional intervention for children who had experienced significant trauma. The transformation that followed David's decision to trust Elena's approach over Dr. Whitfield's therapeutic management began immediately and unfolded with the quiet power of authentic healing finally given space to flourish. Within days of rejecting the clinical framework that had pathologized their natural recovery, both Marcus and Isabella began demonstrating emotional growth that surpassed anything that systematic intervention had promised to achieve. Marcus's artistic expression evolved into something that resembled visual poetry, his drawings becoming increasingly sophisticated narratives about loss, memory, and hope. The empty houses and broken-winged birds that had characterized his early grief were replaced by detailed scenes of families sharing meals, children playing in gardens with adults reading nearby, and houses with warm light glowing from every window. But more significantly, Marcus began including himself in these drawings, always positioned near the adults who represented safety and connection. Elena discovered one particular drawing that captured the essence of Marcus's healing journey, a detailed sketch of their morning routine, showing Elena reading in the living room while Marcus sat by the window watching the sunrise, both figures peaceful and content in their shared solitude. At the bottom of the page, Marcus had written his first voluntary words in months, "This is when I feel safe enough to think about Mama." Isabella's communication underwent an equally remarkable transformation. Her elaborate metaphors and creative narratives became more sophisticated and purposeful, demonstrating her growing ability to use imagination as a tool for understanding complex emotions rather than escaping from them. She began creating what she called feeling maps, detailed drawings that showed how different emotions moved through her body and connected to memories of her mother. One evening, Isabella presented Elena and David with a comprehensive feeling map that illustrated her understanding of grief as a weather system that included storms, gentle rain, sunshine, and periods of calm. "Sadness isn't bad weather," she explained with the authority of someone who had developed her own emotional meteorology. "It's just weather that misses someone really important, and missing someone means you loved them really well." David found himself documenting these moments of profound emotional intelligence, recognizing that Isabella's creative processing was far more sophisticated than any therapeutic intervention could have provided. Her ability to understand abstract concepts through concrete imagery, to find comfort through imaginative narrative, and to help others understand difficult emotions through creative explanation demonstrated resilience that professional assessment had completely missed. The morning routines that had been disrupted by therapeutic evaluation returned to their natural rhythm, but with deeper trust and more authentic communication than before. Marcus began leaving drawings on the kitchen counter that told stories about his dreams, his memories of his mother, and his growing sense of safety in their daily life. Elena would study each drawing carefully, sometimes asking gentle questions that helped Marcus explore the emotions embedded in his artistic expression. Isabella used breakfast time to share increasingly sophisticated observations about the world around them, her creative communication serving as a bridge between her internal emotional experience and the external reality she was learning to navigate without her mother's presence. Her morning observations became a form of collaborative storytelling, with Elena and David contributing details that helped Isabella develop her ideas into comprehensive narratives about resilience, community, and hope. The school pickup routine evolved into informal family meetings where all three of them shared observations about their day and planned activities that honored both individual needs and collective connection. Marcus began contributing ideas for weekend adventures, suggesting visits to art museums where he could study how other people expressed emotions through visual creativity. Isabella proposed elaborate family projects, like creating a garden that would attract birds her mother had loved, or preparing special meals that combined practical cooking skills with creative presentation. Elena recognized that both children were demonstrating what trauma specialists call post-traumatic growth, the development of emotional resources and life perspectives that actually exceeded their pre-trauma functioning. Marcus was becoming more thoughtful and observant than he had been before his mother's death, his artistic abilities serving as both healing mechanism and enhanced way of understanding the world. Isabella was developing emotional intelligence and creative problem-solving skills that surpassed typical developmental expectations for her age group. But perhaps most significantly, both children began actively supporting each other's healing in ways that no therapeutic intervention could have orchestrated. Marcus started creating drawings specifically designed to help Isabella work through difficult emotions, visual representations of her feeling maps that showed how sadness could coexist with joy, how missing someone could strengthen rather than weaken their memory. Isabella began telling stories that included characters who communicated through art rather than words, creating narrative space for Marcus's selective verbal communication to be valued rather than pathologized. Elena observed these sibling interactions with growing appreciation for the children's natural wisdom about healing and connection. They were developing their own family culture that honored both their loss and their resilience, creating rituals and traditions that helped them remember their mother while building new sources of joy and meaning. David began participating more actively in their healing process, not as someone monitoring their progress for evidence of appropriate recovery, but as a family member learning alongside his children about how to carry grief with grace. He started sharing his own memories of their mother, not as therapeutic exercises designed to facilitate healthy processing, but as natural conversations that kept her presence alive in their daily experience. These family conversations revealed something that Dr. Whitfield's clinical assessment had missed entirely. Marcus and Isabella were not avoiding their grief or denying the reality of their loss. Instead, they were developing sophisticated ways of integrating their mother's death into their ongoing life story, finding methods of honoring her memory while remaining open to new experiences of love and connection. Elena documented these developments in a private journal that served as evidence of healing that could not be measured by standardized assessment tools. She recorded Marcus's first spontaneous verbal expression of missing his mother, delivered during a quiet moment while they were preparing dinner. "I think Mama would like watching us cook together." She noted Isabella's growing ability to comfort herself during difficult moments, using the breathing techniques and imaginative narratives she had developed to navigate overwhelming emotions. The journal became Eleanor's way of honoring the children's individual healing journey while creating a record that could advocate for relationship-based approaches to childhood trauma recovery. Each entry documented progress that was invisible to clinical evaluation, but profound in its impact on the children's daily functioning and emotional well-being. David's own healing became an unexpected component of their family recovery. As he learned to trust Marcus and Isabella's natural resilience rather than monitoring their behavior for signs of concerning symptoms, he began processing his own grief more authentically. Elena observed that David's anxiety about his adequacy as a single parent diminished as he recognized his children's remarkable capacity for healing when they felt truly seen and supported. The ripple effects of their transformed approach to healing extended beyond their immediate family. Marcus's teacher reported that his classroom participation had increased significantly, not through forced verbal communication, but through creative contributions that demonstrated his engagement and understanding. Isabella's teacher noted her improved ability to focus on academic tasks and her emerging leadership skills in helping other students navigate social difficulties. Elena began receiving inquiries from other families who had heard about their approach to supporting children through grief and loss. Word spread through Manhattan's educational and social networks about a family that had chosen relationship-based healing over therapeutic management and was demonstrating remarkable results. Parents who were struggling with children's trauma responses began asking Elena for guidance about alternatives to intensive clinical intervention. These conversations led Elena to develop informal support networks for families who wanted to prioritize authentic healing over systematic recovery protocols. She began sharing her understanding about how children process loss when they feel safe enough to be authentic, how natural resilience emerges when it's not pathologized as inadequate, and how relationship-based support can create conditions for post-traumatic growth that exceeds pre-trauma functioning. David found himself becoming an advocate for trusting children's natural healing abilities rather than imposing adult expectations about what their recovery should look like. He began speaking informally with other parents about the importance of supporting rather than managing childhood emotional development, particularly in the context of significant loss or trauma. The success of their approach attracted attention from professionals who were questioning traditional therapeutic frameworks for childhood trauma recovery. Elena received contact from researchers who were studying relationship-based healing approaches, educators who were exploring alternatives to clinical intervention for students experiencing grief, and social workers who were interested in family-centered support models that prioritized authentic connection over systematic treatment. But the most meaningful validation of their approach came from Marcus and Isabella themselves. 6 months after David's decision to reject Dr. Whitfield's therapeutic management, both children were demonstrating emotional resilience, creative problem-solving abilities, and social connections that exceeded anything that clinical intervention had promised to achieve. Marcus had begun speaking more frequently and purposefully, his selective verbal communication evolving into thoughtful contributions that reflected his growing sense of safety and belonging. His artistic expression had become a bridge between his internal emotional experience and his ability to connect with others, serving both healing and communication functions that supported his overall development. Isabella's creative intelligence had matured into sophisticated emotional understanding that helped her navigate complex social situations and support other children who were experiencing difficulties. Her imaginative narratives had become tools for understanding rather than escaping reality, demonstrating her remarkable capacity to find meaning and hope in the midst of loss. The transformation that began with Elena's quiet presence and David's decision to trust relationship over protocol had created a family culture that honored both grief and joy, individual healing and collective connection, authentic expression and mutual support. Their success would become evidence that healing happens in relationship rather than through technique, that children's natural resilience is often more therapeutic than professional intervention, and that love without measurement might be the most powerful healing force available to families navigating impossible loss. 2 years after David's pivotal decision to trust relationship over protocol, the Blackstone family received an invitation that would transform their personal healing journey into a catalyst for systemic change across the country. Dr. Rebecca Matthews, director of the National Institute for Child Development, had been quietly studying alternative approaches to childhood trauma recovery and had identified Elena's relationship-based methods as a model that challenged fundamental assumptions about therapeutic intervention. The invitation was to present their story at the National Conference on Childhood Resilience, attended by pediatric psychologists, social workers, educators, and policymakers from across North America. Dr. Matthews had reviewed extensive documentation of Marcus and Isabella's recovery, including academic performance data, social development, assessments, and long-term emotional stability indicators that demonstrated outcomes superior to children who had received traditional therapeutic intervention. Elena initially hesitated to accept the invitation, preferring the quiet satisfaction of supporting individual families over the public exposure that professional presentation would require. But David convinced her that sharing their experience could help other families who were struggling with the pressure to choose systematic treatment over intuitive caregiving. Marcus, now 9 years old, had evolved into a thoughtful, articulate child whose selective communication had transformed into purposeful expression that reflected deep emotional intelligence. His artwork had garnered attention from local galleries, not as curiosity about a child who had overcome trauma, but as sophisticated visual narratives that demonstrated remarkable insight into human experience. He had begun teaching art classes for other children who were processing loss, using creative expression as a bridge to understanding emotions that felt too complex for words. Isabella, approaching 11, had developed into a natural leader whose imaginative problem-solving abilities had made her a sought-after mediator among her peers. Her creative intelligence had matured into practical wisdom that helped other children navigate social difficulties, academic challenges, and family changes. Teachers regularly consulted with Isabella about strategies for supporting students who seemed overwhelmed by emotional or social pressures. The conference presentation took place in a packed auditorium filled with professionals who had been trained to believe that childhood trauma required systematic intervention by qualified experts. Elena stood at the podium with David, Marcus, and Isabella beside her, preparing to share their story with an audience that might interpret their success as an anomaly rather than evidence of healing principles that could be widely applied. Elena began by describing her first morning with Marcus and Isabella, 2 children whose grief had been pathologized as dysfunction rather than recognized as natural response to devastating loss. She explained how diagnostic categories had missed the resilience that emerged when children felt safe enough to be authentic, how therapeutic pressure had actually impeded the healing that began when evaluation was replaced by acceptance. Marcus stepped forward to address the audience directly, his voice clear and confident as he described his experience of being assessed for appropriate recovery rather than supported for individual healing. Adults kept asking me to talk about feelings before I felt safe enough to have feelings, he said with the insight of someone who had learned to trust his own emotional process. Elena never asked me to be different than I was. She just made space for me to become who I needed to become. Isabella's presentation captivated the audience with her sophisticated analysis of how creative thinking had helped her integrate loss while maintaining access to joy and hope. She explained her feeling maps, her emotional weather systems, and her discovery that imagination could be a tool for understanding reality rather than escaping from it. Grown-ups sometimes think that children who use creativity to understand difficult things are avoiding reality, she said with gentle authority. But creativity is how some people make sense of reality when it's too big for regular thinking. The audience's response revealed the profound impact of hearing children's perspectives on their own healing process. Mental health professionals, who had spent careers implementing systematic interventions, began questioning whether their approaches honored children's natural wisdom about recovery. Educators who had been trained to identify concerning behaviors started considering how they might recognize resilience instead of pathology. Dr. Matthews concluded the presentation by sharing research data that supported Elena's relationship-based approach. Children who received consistent, patient, accepting care showed better long-term outcomes than those who participated in intensive therapeutic protocols. Academic performance, social connections, emotional regulation, and creative problem-solving abilities all improved more significantly when children felt supported rather than managed during their recovery process. But the most powerful evidence came from follow-up studies of families who had implemented Elena's methods. Parents reported decreased anxiety about their children's healing timelines, improved family relationships, and greater confidence in trusting their children's natural resilience. Children demonstrated post-traumatic growth that exceeded pre-trauma functioning, developing emotional intelligence and creative abilities that enhanced their overall life experience. The conference generated national attention for relationship-based approaches to childhood trauma recovery. Elena received requests from universities wanting to develop training programs that prioritized authentic connection over systematic intervention. School districts began exploring policies that would support children's individual healing journeys rather than requiring therapeutic compliance with standardized expectations. David established the Blackstone Foundation for family-centered healing, providing resources and support for families who wanted to prioritize relationship over protocol in addressing childhood trauma. The Foundation's mission was to advocate for children's right to heal in ways that felt authentic rather than convenient for adult measurement. Elena developed a training curriculum for caregivers, educators, and families that taught the principles of relationship-based healing, how to witness children's pain without trying to fix it, how to support natural resilience without pathologizing individual differences, how to create safety that allowed authentic expression rather than performance of appropriate recovery. Marcus and Isabella became advocates for children's voices in decisions about their own healing, speaking at conferences and contributing to research about childhood resilience. Their perspectives challenged adult assumptions about what recovery should look like and demonstrated the sophisticated wisdom that children possess about their own emotional needs. The ripple effects of their story continued expanding, influencing policy discussions about mental health services for children. educational approaches to supporting students who had experienced trauma, and family court decisions about custody arrangements that prioritize children's emotional well-being over systematic therapeutic intervention. 5 years after Elena's quiet decision to trust Marcus and Isabella's natural healing process, their approach had become a model for trauma-informed care that honored children's individual recovery journeys. But the most meaningful outcome was not professional recognition or systemic change. It was the daily reality of a family that had learned to carry grief with grace, to find joy without forgetting loss, and to trust that healing happens in relationship rather than through technique. Elena continued working with the Blackstone family while supporting other families who were learning to prioritize authentic connection over therapeutic management. Marcus and Isabella grew into adolescents, whose emotional intelligence and creative abilities served as resources for their peers and their community. David became a father who trusted his children's wisdom about their own needs rather than seeking professional validation for every parenting decision. Their story proved that love without measurement might be the most powerful healing force available to families navigating impossible loss. That children's natural resilience often exceeds professional expectations, and that sometimes the most therapeutic thing adults can do is trust children to show them what authentic healing looks like. If this story moved you, if you recognize the power of witnessing healing rather than managing it, if you believe that children deserve caregivers who trust their natural wisdom about recovery, then you've found a community that values authentic connection over systematic intervention. Please subscribe to our channel for more stories that challenge assumptions about how healing happens, that honor individual differences in processing trauma, and that demonstrate the remarkable resilience that emerges when children feel truly seen and accepted. Share your own experiences with relationship-based healing in the comments below. Your story might provide hope for families who are questioning whether love is enough to support their children through impossible loss. Remember that behind every child who seems broken lies wisdom about healing, that adults often miss when we prioritize fixing over witnessing, technique over relationship, measurement over trust. Your willingness to see children's authentic selves rather than their symptoms might be exactly what they need to discover their own remarkable capacity for recovery. Hit that subscribe button if you believe that healing happens in relationship, that children know more about recovery than we often give them credit for, and that sometimes the most professional thing we can do is trust love to be louder than fear, connection to be stronger than protocol, and authentic presence to be more therapeutic than any intervention we could impose. Until next time, keep believing that every child deserves caregivers who can witness their healing without needing to control its timeline, who can support their resilience without pathologizing their differences, and who can trust that love is not just enough, it's everything.